All right, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to pick up in this video, continuing to talk about transport processes, continuing to talk about reabsorption, but in particular, we're going to look at water reabsorption, right, for the next few minutes. So when you think about water reabsorption, this is kind of the main thing when you at kind of a high level, gross level, what you think about when you think of um, reabsorption of things in the kidney, right? We're often we're thinking about water, right? So meaning we've got water in our blood, that water is then filtered out, and then we reabsorb a lot of that water, right? When you urinate, right, the bulk of that urine, right, the vast majority of that urine is water, right? And so water plays a big role um, in this process, and the kidneys have a big role to play in filtering what is essentially our water, water in our blood, along with the other solutes that we've talked about and that we will continue to talk about, right? So water can move in a couple of different ways, right? One, it can move paracellularly, right? So remember that's between cells, right? In between adjacent cells, and then it can also move transcellularly across a cell, as we will see. Now, for water, right, in general, so we can talk about glucose and we can talk about sodium, but when you talk about the volume of material that is filtered each day, right, that volume is the water, right? That again is coming from the blood. So we filter, right? We have the amount of fluid that we filter, and then we have the amount of fluid that we excrete, right? So the fluid filtered versus the fluid excreted, right? So if you recall, we produce, right? We filter and produce about 180 liters of fluid a day, right? And again, I'll ask you. I think I asked in one of the previous parts. Um, do we do we excrete 180 liters a day, right? Do you urinate 180 liters a day? No, right? Nowhere close, right? So you can contrast the amount that you filter versus the amount that you excrete, right? And so we excrete maybe a liter and a half a day, right? It can vary, but maybe somewhere around a liter and a half a day, right? So where does the rest of that fluid go, right? The other 99% that we don't excrete in the urine, well, it just gets reabsorbed, right? And so, why are you filtering all of this fluid and all of these things at the level of the glomerulus, right? Why are you filtering all of it if you're just going to then uh, reabsorb it, right? Well, one thing is there's lots of things in the blood, including waste products, right? And so by filtering it all, right, you essentially dump it all, right? Dump it all into the capsular space. Once it's out of the blood and it's in that capsular space in the nephron, it's open to it's essentially open to the external environment, right? So it's out of the internal environment. And so this high filtration rate helps us, get rid of unwanted molecules, but then we have all these processes that we've talked about that allow us to then reabsorb the things that we do want, right? So the glucose and the sodium and the water that we're talking about, right? So you've got that, and you've also got the filtering of ions, water, and you can almost think of it in terms of a um, in terms of simplicity, in the sense that it's easier just to dump everything, right? Filter everything, and then reabsorb the things that you need, as opposed to just selectively filtering out the potentially harmful things or the waste products. Just filter everything, dump it, and then reabsorb, right? And so in the case of the water, this reabsorption, it's going to change based on where you're looking in the nephron, so in the tubule. Most of it is in the proximal convoluted tubule, as we saw with sodium and many other molecules. And in this case, it's being reabsorbed through something called aquaporins, right? And so aquaporins are sometimes they're described as like the plumbing system of the cell, right? They're crucial in allowing substances and specifically water to flow in and out of cells, but also between cells as well, right? And so Peter Augrey, Dr. Peter Augrey, who he may still be there. I can't remember if he is or isn't, but he was forever at the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. And in 2003, he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for the discovery of aquaporin channels. Right. So it was a big enough deal to warrant the receipt of a Nobel Prize in chemistry, right? So essentially, what it's doing is it's allowing the movement of the water to go from the, say, tubular fluid into the cell, and then from the inside of the cell, ultimately back into the blood, right? So for this water reabsorption, again, some of it's going to occur, most of it's going to occur in the proximal convoluted tubule, right, 65% or so. Some of it is going to occur in the nephron loop. As we'll see, only parts of the nephron loop are permeable to water. Other parts are not, as we'll see. And then you can also have regions like the distal convoluted tubule and our collecting ducts. In these cases, the kind of latter parts, the end parts of our nephron, including the collecting duct, are under the influence of various hormones, right? And so one hormone is aldosterone, right? So again, we've talked about aldosterone. You've heard aldosterone many times already. And so we won't go into all the details, right? But again, this is aldosterone. This is the mechanism by which it works. It's helping to reabsorb sodium, thus reabsorb water. When you reabsorb sodium and water follows it, that water reabsorption, that type of reabsorption, is called obligatory water reabsorption, right? Because water is obliged to follow sodium. You reabsorb sodium, the sodium exerts that osmotic gradient, that osmotic pressure, and then think of it as like pulling the water with it, right? That's called obligatory water reabsorption. You also have ADH, right, or antidiuretic hormone, right? So think to diurese means to excrete urine, right? So to urinate. So if you antidiurese, or if you have a hormone that opposes diuresis, you're going to retain more of that water, right? You're going to hold on to more of that fluid and thus produce less urine, right? Um, and so again, ADH, it's going to promote the uh, production of aquaporin channels, right? They're just proteins, so it's synthesizing, it's stimulating protein synthesis, right? So those aquaporin channels are then inserted into the distal regions of our nephron. So think like parts of the collecting duct, maybe parts of our distal convoluted tubule, and um, it's going to decrease the volume of urine, right? Um, because we are reabsorbing more, right? And that's going to result in a stronger right, a greater concentration of urine because we have less volume, right? We have less water in the urine, so the solutes that are going to end up in the urine are going to be more concentrated, right? So in this case, the antidiuretic hormone, the ADH, is not um, it's not influencing any solutes, right? So it's not affecting sodium, right? And so when you have water reabsorption that is independent of sodium, you call this facultative water reabsorption. So think water is being reabsorbed and water only, right? There's no water following the sodium, it's just the water, right? So again, this is ADH, right? You can think of where ADH comes from, right? So it's coming from our posterior pituitary. It's made in the hypothalamus. It's stored in the posterior pituitary. There are conditions, one called diabetes insipidus, that results in an excess production of urine because of an insufficient amount of, or an inadequate amount of ADH, right? There's also the opposite case, and in which case this is called SIADH, or syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone, but essentially you secrete too much antidiuretic hormone, right? So in diabetes insipidus, the patients produce a very large amount of urine, and that urine that is produced is very dilute, right? Because you've got all of this extra water, right? So essentially, think of it like this, right? You remove the aquaporin channels because you don't have enough ADH, and so you produce really, really large volumes of urine, but the osmolality, or think the concentration of that urine, is very, very dilute. So these patients can become very dehydrated and be very thirsty as well. Okay, so here you can see kind of the mechanism by which ADH is working, right? So again, here are all of your aquaporin channels, right, in this basal surface, in this apical or luminal surface. Here are your aquaporin channels, and we're moving those through transcellularly, right? So across the cell, through the aquaporin channels, right? And again, so this is osmosis. Um, and again, in this case, this would be that facultative water reabsorption, right? So it's acting on these principal cells in the kind of latter parts of the nephron, so collecting tubules, collecting ducts, facultative water reabsorption, just water being reabsorbed, going into the um, going into the blood, right? So for all of these, don't just think about what the hormone is doing or where the solute or molecule or water in this case, don't think of just where it's going, but think of what's the end result, right? So in this case, if you have, this ADH, this antidiuretic hormone, and you get more of this facultative water reabsorption, what's that going to do to blood volume, right? Well, it's going to increase blood volume, right? Okay, well, what's that going to do to blood pressure? Well, it's going to increase blood pressure, right? So this is why patients in clinical settings are sometimes given a medication called vasopressin, and it is synthetic ADH. Right? So ADH is also called vasopressin. And what it's doing is it's helping to constrict blood vessels, but also, so hence the term vasopressin, it's constricting blood vessels, but it's also acting to reabsorb this amount of water that's going to contribute to increased blood volume and thus increased blood pressure, right? And so don't just again think of it, try to frame it in a clinical context, right? We're not just reabsorbing water and that's it, but right, why are we reabsorbing water, and what's the result of reabsorbing all of this water? Okay. So this here, just kind of a summary overview of water transport. Again, most of it is that obligatory water reabsorption. Reabsorb sodium, water follows the sodium. Some of it is in our nephron loop, right? As we'll see, only parts of the nephron loop are permeable to water, and then certain parts are only permeable to solutes. And then the collecting tubules and collecting duct, right? That last part of the nephron and our collecting duct here, under the influence of things like ADH, are going to be involved in that facultative water reabsorption. Again, water only, not following a solute, not following sodium. Right? So let's stop here and we'll pick up in our next part and we'll look at some other solutes, things like potassium, and then we'll move into things like calcium and phosphate.